So today we're going to talk about ISO and how it affects getting the proper exposure for your image in the camera. So in the past, I've talked about the histogram. I've done videos on the histogram, on what the histogram is and how to use it to help get a well-exposed image. And then I've talked about using shutter speed and aperture on influencing how that histogram looks so you get that image. The one thing I haven't talked about yet is ISO, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So what is ISO? ISO is one part of the exposure triangle, and we've talked about shutter speed and aperture in the past, and I'll put links to those videos in the description below. ISO is another thing that controls the lightness or darkness of the image in your camera, and it influences how the camera sensor deals with the light. ISO is typically a numerical value that ranges from 100 all the way up to 25,600, and within that range of numbers, ISO 100, your camera needs more light to properly expose the image, and at a higher ISO value, say like 6400, your camera needs less light to properly expose an image in the camera. Now, how does it do that? So the way it works is the light hits the sensor, and a lot of people describe ISO as making the camera sensor more or less sensitive to light. But really, the camera sensor's getting the same amount of light at their shutter speed and aperture regardless. It's what it's going to do with that light. So ISO 100, it's doing very minimal to the light. That's the light hitting the camera. It's not doing anything technical, anything software-wise to change that. Now, at higher ISOs, what you're telling your camera sensor to do is amplify that light or apply more gain to that light. So it's the same light hitting the sensor, just the camera is running an algorithm against that light to make the image brighter. So when you're ISO 100, there's not a whole lot of that going on. It's pretty much what the light is hitting the camera at your base ISO. As you start to work your way up, your camera can start to do more software to start applying that gain. It's like turning the volume up on your car stereo. You turn it up, and it increases the volume while your camera sensor is turning that gain up, amplifying that light that's hitting the sensor. That's what ISO is. Low number, it's not doing a lot. At a higher number, it's applying more amplification, more gain, increasing that light, even though it's the same amount of light hitting that sensor. Now, of course, there's a downside to doing that. Even though your image starts to look better exposed and lets you have more flexibility in changing your shutter speed or aperture to get the image that you want, increasing that ISO does start to add noise to it, because as you apply that gain, as you amplify that light, any noise that is in that image is going to start to get amplified as well. So as you start to work your way up from ISO 100 to the higher end, something like, if you go all the way up to like 25,600, there's going to be a fair amount of noise because you've really cranked that volume, that amplification of that light. And if there's just not enough light in there, that amplification is going to start to cause various noise, luminance noise, and things like that in your image. So you do want to be careful how high you turn that ISO up, because it does have some cons. However, modern day cameras are really pretty good with ISO, and I feel pretty comfortable running anything from ISO 100 to 3200 without a whole lot of thought. And if I need to get up to around 6400 to actually get the image I want, I'm not going to stress about it, because I want that well-exposed image, and if it takes ISO 6400 to do it, then I'll do it. Now, in landscape photography, that's typically not an issue. Anything from ISO 100 to maybe up to 3200 for certain conditions might need to be done, but it's not that big a deal. Modern day cameras are pretty good with handling their ISO and keeping that noise to a minimum. It'll be there, but it's not as bad as it once was. Now, as landscape photographers, one of the advantages we have is we tend to be shooting from a tripod a lot of the time, which means we can keep that ISO pretty low, down around that 100, because you're going to end up with an aperture that's, your f8, f11 to get the depth of field you want, but then your shutter speed to let enough light in, because your aperture at f8, f11 is, closing down, not letting as much light in. If you're ISO 100, your camera needs more light to properly expose the image, which means your shutter speed is going to be your big variable. But we're on a tripod, so if we need to slow that shutter speed way down to like 1/8 of a second or like something like that, we're on a tripod, so we're not hand holding it, we won't have camera shake, and so we can get away with doing those little ISOs quite a bit. So for that reason, most of the time when I'm out shooting, I'm shooting at my camera's base ISO 64, ISO 100, whichever camera I'm on. That's what I'm aiming for, is to get down there. We are going to talk about some of the situations where you won't be able to do that, and you're going to want to change your ISO to get the image you want. So like I said, in my day-to-day use, because I shoot from a tripod most often, I'm usually trying to keep that ISO down to 100. 64 if it's on my Nikon Z7 II, which can do it. I try to keep it as low as I can. That's my typical goal, and then I work with my aperture and shutter speed from there. Again, the tripod is what allows me to do that because I can run those slower shutter speeds in order to get the images I want. I don't have the camera shake to contend with. So we are going to demonstrate some of this today, so we're going to hop down here. I came out to a little creek with some moving water. It's fairly early in the morning, and I'm in the shade, so the lighting conditions are a little dimmer than you'd normally get. You know, it's definitely not a midday, relatively early morning. So the light is somewhat low, at least it's early morning light. So we're going to jump down here. I'm going to demonstrate changing the ISO value, what effect it has on the image. And then we're going to talk about the couple of exceptions where you do need to change your ISO and get away from that ISO 100 in order to get the shot you want. And we'll talk about that while we're down there as well. See you over there. Okay, I'm shooting in somewhat of a scene I wouldn't normally shoot, partially because of just the glare, the time of day. These are not portfolio shots here. These are more for demonstration. So what I've got is I'm at this creek and I've got the water sort of flowing through. And the reason I'm shooting this way is because if I shoot this way, even with the polarizer, I'm getting a significant amount of glare off the water and I really can't demonstrate what I want. Typically, I would shoot with the water coming towards me. That just makes for a more pleasing image. But for purposes of demonstration, what I've got, I have this water moving over these rocks over here. It's got ripples, there's some movement, it's darker this way. So these are going to be example images only, just to sort of show you the effects of ISO, and it will help me demonstrate why you might want to change that ISO. So we're going to dive in here and take a look. So what we're going to do is we're going to start first and do what I said I don't normally do, and we're going to say an ISO of 800. And I'm going to get the exposure set properly in the camera, ISO 800. And then I'm not going to change shutter speed. I'm not going to change aperture, but I'm going to change my ISO down to 100. And we're going to watch what happens to the image. And then we're going to do the other thing. We're going to take it from ISO 800 to ISO 1600 and watch what happens to the image. In both those examples, I'm not going to change the shutter speed or aperture. We're just going to change the ISO so you can see what happens. And you'll see how that makes the sensor change how it handles the light that's hitting the sensor. Okay, so here we are, and I have my ISO set to 800. I'm aperture f11, and my shutter speed is 1/6. And my histogram's looking about like I want. I got a little bit of bump on the highlight over here on the right, just where I want. Probably these white caps to get the scene in focus. And you can see the image is pretty well exposed. It's right about where I want my histogram. Take the shot. Awesome. We've got that. So what we're going to do is we are only going to change ISO. We're going to take ISO down to 100 and watch what happens to the image. Starts to get darker and darker. I have not changed my shutter speed or my aperture. And so now my camera is not doing as much amplification of the light or anything like that. The scene gets much darker, and that's the effect ISO has on it. So let's take the ISO. We're going to just snap that picture real quick. Now let's take my ISO back up to 800. This is where I set at. Well exposed image. Histogram looks good. We like that. So let's take my ISO up to 1600. We're going to be making my sensor more sensitive to light, aka it's going to apply some amplification and gain to the image in order to boost the light that is hitting the sensor. So let's go ahead and take that ISO. We're going to kick it up to 1600. And there we are up at 1600. Let's go a little further. Let's take it all the way up to 3200. And here we can see the image is overexposed. The histogram is way far over here to the right, and it is now an overexposed image. So that's what changing the ISO does to your exposure. You know, if you increase your ISO, move it to a larger number, it is going to apply more gain, more amplification of light, make the images brighter. And then if you reduce your ISO down to the 100, your camera needs more light to get into it and go from there. So real quick, let's take this back down to 100. That's what I would normally shoot at. So ISO 100. Too dark, histogram's way over here to the left. I like my aperture because I want that depth of field. So what I'm going to change is we're going to change my shutter speed and start to slow that shutter speed down. And watch what happens. Histogram comes over. I hit 1.3 second exposure. Make sure we're in focus. Take the image. And I start to get the motion blur of the water, which in this case I sort of like, obviously. So that's it. That's ISO. That's taking it from starting at ISO 800, taking it up to 1600, taking it down to 100. and sort of showing you what the effect of ISO has in the image if you don't change your shutter speed or your aperture. So that's how ISO works, and that was the demonstration of the basics of, higher ISO makes the scene brighter, lower ISO makes it darker. Use your shutter speed and aperture to compensate as you will. Now for landscape photographers, like I've noted before, when you're on a tripod, we can do the slow shutter speed, so we can typically keep those ISOs pretty low to get nice noise-free images, which make for great post-processing. However, there are times you can be in the field that you need to change that ISO to get the image you want, and you can't go with just ISO 100 or the lowest ISO possible. Some of those things are moving water like we have here, and that could be waterfalls, water flowing through a creek. I've talked before about the motion blur, style to taste, but in this particular case, say I wanted to freeze this water as it was rolling over the rocks. We saw if I'm at ISO 100, I had to have a very slow shutter speed in order to get a well-exposed image. I liked my aperture, so the only setting I have to change is ISO. So to freeze this water, I would need to raise that ISO rather significantly to get a shutter speed that would freeze that water. And that's a scenario where you'll want to change your ISO and bring it up. For example, say you're photographing a waterfall and you want some motion blur, but you still want a little bit of detail in that water. That's a case where sometimes you're going to need to adjust your ISO to get to the shutter speed you want. Because maybe if you're running shutter speed 100, the water's moving too fast and that slower speed just completely turns it completely white with no detail. So in that case, you might need to bump up ISO 400, ISO 800, so that you can speed that shutter speed up a bit to get that creative look you want in the water. And another element that you might need to change your ISO for is, we can control keeping the camera still on a tripod, but what if it's windy out and you're photographing fall leaves or, the leaves in the tree or tall grasses? Those things are going to be blowing, shifting back and forth. And while your camera may be stable, the element in your frame is moving and changing and adjusting. So that's a scenario if it's blustery conditions out that you might need to bump your ISO up so that you're freezing the tree leaves and not getting blur from the leaves. Because if you have movement in your scene, anything from the water, tall grasses blowing in the wind, leaves, trees blowing in the wind, you're going to need to speed that shutter speed up. And sometimes you're going to need to bring that ISO up in order to freeze that motion. So that's another scenario where sometimes you'll need to bring that ISO up higher than 100. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like we said earlier, modern day cameras do great with higher ISOs. It's not to be concerned about if that's what you need to do to get the image you want. So the other time you might need to change your ISO is if you're out practicing photography, hand holding your camera. Maybe you're just, moving quickly, don't want to set up on a tripod. Well, in those cases, you need to make sure you get nice and steady. The cameras have, image stabilization, things like that. But sometimes you're going to exceed that in certain conditions, especially if you're in the shade or things like that. Again, same concepts apply if you need to stop water or anything like that. But if you're hand holding your camera, those are times you may need to bring your ISO up a little higher so that you don't get motion blur from the camera shake. So those are just some of the examples of when you might need to change your ISO away from those lower values. So that's ISO and how it affects the exposure of the image in your camera. It's one of the tools, one of the three you can use to help get the proper exposure: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. We've gone over the basics, why you tend to want to be down towards the lower side of the ISO 100 or so, why that works pretty well for us landscape photographers. But we also covered those situations where that's not always practical and when you may want to move that ISO up, make it a little higher so that you can adjust that shutter speed to get the look that you're after. And as we explained, with modern day cameras, those higher ISOs are really no big deal. There's a little bit of noise introduced, but they're much better than they were in the past. So if you need to bump that ISO up, don't be afraid of it. Don't pass up a good shot because you were afraid to move your ISO up. It's fine to do so. So now that you know how to use ISO, you can use it to affect the histogram. I've done a video on the histogram, why it's important, and how to use it to get a well-exposed image. I'll link to the video down below. And now you can take the pieces of using shutter speed, aperture, and ISO to influence that histogram, get the photos you want, make sure they're well exposed, and you're well on your way to improving your landscape photography and having an easier time in post-processing. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, mini gear reviews, behind the scenes, be sure to click that subscribe button so you don't miss any landscape photography content from me in the future. And thank you for watching.